Okay, so welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing Cys-Loop receptors or Cys-Loop ligand-gated ion channels. Okay, right. So in this next video what we want to talk about is a non-human example of a Cys-Loop ligand-gated ion channel in more detail. So we've now been through the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, the GABA A receptors, the glycine receptors and the 5-HT3 receptors, which are the main examples of families of Cys-Loop ligand-gated ion channels present in humans. What we now want to turn our attention to is looking in more detail at an example of a non-human Cys-Loop ligand-gated ion channel. And the Cys-Loop ligand-gated ion channel that we're going to look in more detail at is the GluCl channel, which is found in many different worms. Okay, so GluCl. Now, we've discussed GluCl in a little bit of detail earlier. We discussed that it was a glutamate-gated chloride channel, and in fact that's what this stands for. Okay, the GLU is for glutamate, okay, then it's glutamate-gated chloride channel, and the Cl is then for chloride. Okay, right. So this is unusual because, as we know, in humans, glutamate is the major excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. Okay, it works on ligand-gated ion channels that are not Cys-Loop ligand-gated ion channels, which, when they open, are a sodium or potassium conductive channel, basically, and therefore allow sodium into the cell, which depolarizes the cell. Okay, and therefore they are excitatory. They make it more likely that the postsynaptic cell is going to fire an action potential. Okay, however, in these worms, we have found a channel which is gated by glutamate, which allows in a chloride current into the cell and is therefore inhibitory. Okay, now, what's really interesting about this channel is that it's present on the myocytes, the muscle cells of these worms, okay, and when it opens, it can allow in chloride anions into those muscle cells, and therefore it inhibits the muscle cells from firing action potentials, and thereby inhibits the muscle cells from contracting. Okay, so there is an opportunity, therefore, that if we could design a drug which opens this channel, okay, on the muscle cells of these worms, then we could stop the muscle cells of the worm contracting, and therefore we could paralyze the worm, basically. And we're going to see such an example of a drug later on. Okay, right, but first, let me just discuss the fact that the glutamate-gated chloride channel, unlike all these families that we've been seeing in humans, the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor family, the GABA A receptor family, the glycine receptor family, the 5-HT3 receptor family, in the case of GluCl, it really is just one channel, basically. Okay, it is literally just a homopentamer of 4 identical subunits, which are all GluCl subunits. Okay, so if I draw a picture of it, all of these 5 subunits that build the GluCl channel are identical, okay, and there's only one subunit that you can use to build it, therefore there is just one GluCl channel, basically. Okay, and of course, because it's a homopentamer, that means that it's going to have 5 ligand binding sites, which will be in between all of the subunits of the GluCl channel. Okay, so you'll have a ligand binding site here for glutamate, a ligand binding site here, a ligand binding site here, a ligand binding site there, and finally a ligand binding site there. So 5 ligand binding sites in total. Okay, so this channel binds 5 glutamates, opens, allows in chloride anions, inhibits the postsynaptic cell. Okay, it's important to us because it's on the muscle cells of these worms, and therefore if we could open it, we could paralyze the worms, basically, as well as causing a huge amount of problems with the worm's nervous system, because this channel is all over the nervous system as well, so we can hugely disrupt the worm's nervous system as well. So this is looking like a very hopeful target then for drugs that we could use to treat parasitic worm infections. And indeed there is such a drug which is an agonist at these GluCl channels, okay, and it's called Ivermectin. Okay, right, so Ivermectin is used to treat a huge number of different parasitic worm infections, okay, and one of the major parasitic worm infections that it's used to treat is onchocerciasis. Okay, so I now want to talk about onchocerciasis. So Onchocerciasis is a parasitic worm, or it's caused by a parasitic worm that lives within the skin, basically. Okay, and this parasitic worm is an example of a Venereal nematode. Okay, and I just want to discuss what is actually meant by a Venereal nematode. Okay, right. So firstly, what does nematode mean? And then we'll come on to what a Venereal nematode is. So basically, in the great big categorization of helminths, there are 3 massive categories. Okay, so firstly, let me explain what a helminth is. So a helminth is just the fancy word for a parasitic worm. So a worm that parasitizes humans generally, or other animals. Okay, so parasitic worms are known as helminths. Okay, now in this great family of helminths, there are 3 major categories basically, and one of them is the nematodes. Okay, so helminths are divided up into 3 great categories. One of them is the nematodes, the other ones are the trematodes, okay, and then there's also the cestodes. Okay, now each of these categories has slightly less official names as well. Okay, so the nematodes are also called the roundworms, the trematodes are also called the flukes, the cestodes are also called the tapeworms. Okay, but we'll use the official nomenclature. Okay, right, so we now want to ask, what's a Venereal nematode? So we know now that a nematode is just one of these categories of helminths, okay, but what's a Venereal nematode? Well, basically, nematodes come in 2 great classes, okay. There are the nematodes which parasitize animals by living in their intestines, okay. So they're not really actually inside the body of the animal, they're in the intestine of the animal, and really the intestine is outside of the animal, okay, when you remember that we're effectively a donut-shaped structure. We have a tube going down the middle of us, but that really is the outside of our body. Okay, so nematodes that are in the intestine aren't really inside the body, they're inside the intestine. Okay, so a notable example of an intestinal nematode is Ascaris lumbricoides. Okay, massive great worm that can live in your intestine. Okay, Venereal nematodes, in contrast, are a little bit more creepy, okay, because they actually do live inside you. They live inside your tissue. Okay, so Venereal nematode is a tissue-dwelling nematode, and in fact, Onchocerca volvulus, which is the cause of onchocerciasis, is a Venereal nematode. It lives inside the skin mainly. Okay, specifically it lives inside the dermis and the subcutaneous tissue of the skin. So if I just draw a little picture here of the skin. So remember, the skin has these 3 major layers. Here is the epidermis, which is the outer layer. Then underneath that you have the dermis, and then underneath that you have the subcutaneous tissue. Okay, so here's the epidermis, which contains those 5 or 4 major layers of cells, okay, and that's turning over continuously, and that's the waterproof barrier, basically, okay. Then underneath the epidermis you have all the support structures for the epidermis, okay, which is the dermis structure here, okay, which I'll colour in orange. Okay, so lots of support structures in the dermis. You'll have, for instance, arterioles and venules, you'll have hair follicles, you'll have loads of neurons and sensory apparatus and things like that, okay? But principally it's an area of lots of connective tissue with just other structures inside it. And then underneath the dermis we have the subcutaneous fat layer, okay, which contains adipocytes, basically. Okay, so this is the subcutaneous fat layer. Okay, and basically, Onchocerca volvulus can live within the dermis and the subcutaneous fat layer, basically. It's a worm that lives in these layers, and I might just show it here. Here it is, there it is as a worm. Okay, right, so let me just go through the the transmission of Onchocerca volvulus. How do you actually become infected with this? So Onchocerca volvulus, and by the way, the disease that Onchocerca volvulus causes is what's called onchocerciasis. Onchocerciasis is prevalent in areas of South America and also sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, and it's transmitted between humans by a fly that lives in those areas called the black fly. Okay, so that's the bad guy in all of this. So I will draw a black fly here. So there's its body, and here I'll draw some wings on it. Okay, so these black flies, they generally like to live near water. Okay, so they generally live near rivers. Okay, and that's why onchocerciasis is also called river blindness. Okay, it's called river because you catch it generally near rivers because of the fact that these flies live near rivers. Okay, and it's called blindness then because one of the key things that onchocerciasis can lead to is blindness, and we'll discuss how later on. Okay, right. So basically, the way that onchocerciasis is transmitted between individuals is through these black flies, basically. Okay, so black flies are not particularly nice things. They feed on human skin. Okay, so they go up to humans and take massive great bites out of your skin, basically. Okay, now, little to the black fly's knowledge, it's now going to go up and bite some human that is infected with onchocerciasis. Okay, and it can end up taking in a great big lump of skin which contains the babies of these onchocerca volvulus worms, basically. Okay, so the adult onchocerca volvulus is quite big, so generally the black fly doesn't end up taking in an entire adult. Instead, it ends up taking the little babies that these things can produce. Okay, so when a male onchocerca volvulus gets together with a female onchocerca volvulus, the female can produce many tiny little worms called microfilariae. Okay, so I'll draw these here. So these are representing the microfilariae. Okay, and it's these, generally, that now the black fly is going to end up taking up, basically. So when the black fly goes and bites an individual infected with onchocerca volvulus, it can end up taking in loads of microfilariae. Okay, so in now come the microfilariae into the black fly. Now, I'm not going to pretend to understand what actually happens inside the fly, okay? However, what I do know is that inside the fly, these microfilariae can grow, basically. They get much, much bigger, okay? And they become what is now called infective larvae, okay? So, infective larvae. And then somehow, when the black fly then goes up and bites another human who was previously not infected with onchocerca volvulus, okay, what can then happen is when the black fly bites this second human, it can then end up putting the infective larvae into that second human. And as I say, I don't really understand what is actually happening inside the fly, where the microfilariae are going and how they're then spat back out into this second human, okay? But the important principle is that the microfilariae go into this black fly and out comes this bigger worm, basically, these infective larvae. Okay, so these now go into a fresh human that was previously not infected with the onchocerca volvulus. Okay, so they're now in the skin of this second human. Okay, and what's now going to happen in the skin of this second human is that they grow and they grow and they grow and they grow and they grow until they become the adult onchocerca volvulus. Okay, and it generally takes about 2 to 4 months for a little infective larvus to become an adult onchocerca volvulus. Okay, now, the adult onchocerca volvuli, they can live for 17 years, so they live for a long time, but they don't actually cause any problem. Okay, having the adult onchocerca volvuli in your skin doesn't actually cause that much problem at all. Okay, the problem comes when they start breeding. Okay, so when you get a male and a female onchocerca volvuli together, they can end up breeding, and then the female will produce lots of microfilariae in your skin. Okay, and it's the microfilariae, the little baby worms, that cause the problem. Okay, because the immune system ends up attacking the microfilariae in a way that it doesn't, for some reason, attack the adult worms. Okay. So, when it attacks them in the skin then, it can cause skin rashes, okay, because you're getting inflammation around where the microfilariae are. And then the big problem basically is that these microfilariae don't just stay in the skin, they end up going into portions of the eye, okay, and this is what can then lead to blindness. Okay, so let me tell you about the different portions of the eye that they can go into. So they can go into the cornea, the choroid, and they can also actually end up in cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve. So let me just go over the structure of the eye then. Okay, so I'll do this very basically. Okay, so here I'm drawing the outside of the eye here. Okay, and this is representing the sclera here. And then it's continuing on in the optic nerve here. So I'm drawing the right eye viewed basically in a transverse plane from above, basically. Okay, and the sclera then is continuous with the cornea at the front there. Okay, so to label up pieces here, so this yellow line at the back is representing the sclera. This is the portion of the sclera that continues on to cover cranial nerve number 2, which will be running in the middle there. So I'll just label this up. This is cranial nerve number 2, which is the optic nerve. Okay, and then at the front, the sclera is continuous with the cornea over here. Okay, right, now let's put some more inner layers in there. So firstly, let's put the iris in. So here in blue, this can represent the iris. Okay, and then we'll have the choroid in next. Okay, so at the front, the choroid will obviously be continuous with the ciliary body. And at the back, it will end before we then go into the optic nerve. Okay, so here is this, whoops, that's a little bit big, but oh dear, yeah, that's much too big. I shouldn't have drawn that so big. Okay, try and imagine that that isn't so big. Okay, so here, this portion of red that is inside of the sclera, this is the choroid here. Okay, and then at the front here, these extensions of the choroid inwards, these are what are known as the ciliary bodies. Okay, right, and then in between those two ciliary bodies, you will have the lens suspended, basically, which I'll have in turquoise there. Okay, then finally, let me put the retina on. So here is the retina in orange here. Okay, and it will then have a bunch of neural tissue going in the middle here, which will be the cranial nerve. Okay, so basically you can get these microfilariae of the onchocerca volvulus going into the cornea, the choroid here, even the cranial nerve number 2 here. Okay, and everywhere they go, they're going to cause an inflammatory response. And you can imagine that if this is occurring over a long period of time, which it will be, you're going to be getting inflammatory responses going on in the eye for a long period of time. And that's going to lead to a lot of damage to the eye, and this builds up and up and up until it actually leads to blindness, basically. Okay, and that's one of the leading causes of preventable blindness in sub-Saharan Africa and South America. Okay, right, so that's why this disease is called river blindness, because the black flies live near the river, and the key thing that it causes is this blindness. Okay, right, so Ivermectin is the drug then that is used to treat onchocerca volvulus infections, okay, and it does so by paralysing the onchocerca volvulus worms, okay, by opening these glutamate channels in their myocytes, and also by disturbing their nervous systems. Now, it's not so effective at killing the adult worms, unfortunately. It's very, very effective at killing the microfilariae, however, okay, and since they're the ones that actually cause the disease, they're the ones that actually cause the inflammatory response which leads to the skin rashes and the blindness, they are the biggest problem, basically. Okay, so Ivermectin can prevent the actual blindness that results from being infected with onchocerca volvulus. The problem, of course, is that it doesn't kill the adults. Okay, so you're always going to have the adults there, and therefore you're going to have to take this drug chronically to continue killing the babies that the adults produce. Okay, right. So that now concludes our discussion of cis-loop ligand-gated ion channels.